Hi everyone and welcome to SWPL My Story, and today we are doing another SWPL Home and Abroad segment, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Andy McKeown of Houston Dash. How are you, Andy?
I'm good, mate. Thank you for having me on. Getting settled
Ah,
in here in Texas, so I'm glad to be on. Gives me something to do on my day off.
no, it's not much of a change from when you were at Celtic, but I'm sure you're coping well.
It's the weather's about the same, to be fair. It's only a nice breezy 29 degrees here today at the start of March, so it's different, but I'm settling in well.
So obviously you were sitting in there as head of performance under Fran at Celtic for a number of years. And previous to that you were at Accies. Was a move across the Atlantic and going to a club such as this stature on the cards for you? Maybe an ambition, but seeing it through is maybe a different story.
It was an ambition for sure, especially well even before I started working in the women's game. Pretty much as soon as I get into strength and conditioning and performance as an occupation, like coming over to especially as a strength and conditioning coach, coming to America, especially the southern states in America, is really where you want to be. And somebody who's grown up even in Scotland watching like American football and basketball and stuff like that, being an S&C over here in the States is something that I always wanted to do. So I think that was an ambition for sure, but it's one of those things where it's like it's almost like a pipe dream, isn't it? And then you kind of get into the women's game and then start to establish myself there. It's again coming to the NWSL. It's the biggest. If it's not the best league in the world in women's football. It's certainly the most competitive. It's like one of the two or three best for sure. And it's like again, it's more of a pipe dream than anything you necessarily see yourself doing. And then the next thing you know, I'm here, which is it's quite surreal to be fair. But I was for sure was always something I wanted to do.
So let's take it right back to the beginning and your first steps into the women's game. Obviously, there's a lot of the viewers, or particularly younger viewers, are maybe going through and thinking of their education. A big thing for me in this is showing that there are avenues within the game if you aren't an elite level player. And realistically, not everyone, even people in academies, aren't all going to make it. But that doesn't mean to say it's the end of the road for you. So, how is it you first took your steps into the women's game?
So probably now about 2019. So I was actually doing my master's degree at the time, and so even before that, so I did my undergrad degree in sports coaching, and then I went and pursued my master's in essentially applied strength and conditioning coaching. And at that point, I was like, well, I don't really know where I'm going to take this. To be honest, the main reason that I stuck and did the masters was because I wasn't sure where I was going to take my coaching degree after, like I finished my undergrad. It just so happened that in my last year of undergrad, I focused way more on like strength and conditioning and sports science. So when I had the chance to do the master's degree and focus on strength and conditioning, I thought, all right, that's if nothing else, it gives me a year or two to try and figure out exactly what I want to do with this couple of degrees. So I'd been there on the masters at UWS for probably 4 months, and as part of that, I was the assistant strength and conditioning coach of the Glasgow Rocks, the basketball team. And then one day, Gary Doctor had spoken to Mark McKenna, who was a lecturer at UWS. He was one of the guys who was taking us through some of our modules in the masters. And he spoke to me and said, "Look, there's an opportunity here if you're interested at Hamilton Accies Women." So I was like, "Aye, why not? Might as well." So I spoke to Gary, liked the idea of it. I'd never worked in the women's game before. I'd coached football since like I was 17, so for nearly enough half my life, I'd been coaching football at that point. But it was different going into strength and conditioning and actual lead role. It's different as an assistant S&C in a club or in a sports team, a professional sports team. But then to go and lead in it, I thought, well, I'll try it if nothing else. I went there and probably after like 3 weeks, I was like, you know what, for sure, this is brilliant. This is what I want to do. Like I'd never enjoyed coaching as much as I did when I was at Accies, and I'd only been there like 3 weeks, and I thought, right, for sure, this is finally. I know exactly where I want to take this degree. What I want to put all my time and effort into as like a strength conditioning coach. And I was at Accies for a couple of years, and the experience there was amazing. Especially with Gary. Gary was as a manager. Gary was fantastic because he trusted me, gave me the autonomy to go and do what I do as a coach. The players there were brilliant as well. I had amazing relationships with those players, and as a 2-year learning experience, essentially, because we went through COVID at that point. So you're doing a lot of strength and conditioning stuff through Zoom and coaching through Zoom and that. You know yourself how much of a challenge that could be. As a 2-year learning experience in that environment, it was brilliant. So it kind of happened just purely by fortune on my end. As Gary was looking for an S&C to come in. I spoke to him. He gave me the chance, and from there it's just kind of blown up for there. And I've been in the women's game now for the last 5 years, and I've no intention of leaving it anytime soon, as long as they'll have me.
So I think it's a really good opportunity, and the links that UWS at the time had with Aki's, and how they were able to, it was complementing each other, particularly at that stage. Obviously, the women's games came on massively from then to now, but particularly like a part-time team like Aki's, and they're tapping into the resources that are around them. And they had their team in their training already, so it gave you that experience, but then also gave the players and the coaching staff there some expert input from someone who's immersed within that world. So from there, it then provided the opportunity. It was just coming to that point where teams, particularly like your Rangers and Celtic at that time, were looking to go full time. But with that, was going to need a backroom staff as well. So how did your move to Celtic come about?
So it was, I just finished about 6 months after I finished my Masters, I was coaching private at the same time. So I started up my own private coaching business, and I was doing that at the same time as with Aki's, because obviously Aki's at that point, it was part-time, so they were only training 3 nights a week. So started my own coaching business, and then an application for a PhD at Celtic Women came up, and at that point I thought, well, okay, I'll be honest, at that point it wasn't the PhD that was the main drawing point for me, it was going and coaching at Celtic. So I applied for that, and obviously I got that. That was through UWS as well. I had obviously great ties with people at UWS, and I jumped on a couple of Zoom calls as part of the interview process with Fran, with some of the people at UWS, and they offered me the PhD position. So I went and started that. That lasted probably about 9 months in 2021. Then I realised, okay, the PhD isn't for me. I'll be honest, the PhD, it wasn't. It sounds silly, and it sounds like, it should be fairly obvious at the start. If you're going to go and do a PhD, you need to be expected to, put all your effort into a PhD. The PhD was the secondary drawing point for me, to be honest. It was the coaching and being a strength and conditioning coach and a sports scientist or whatever. So I stepped back from that at the end of 2021, and effectively went back coaching private for about 6 months, but I still did some work with the Celtic players. So I was a similar idea to what it was like at Aki's. I was in a couple of days at Celtic and I was coaching private at the same time. And then the end of the 2021-22 season, going into that off-season, a few of the players at Celtic, I continued working with them over the off-season, and then moving into the following pre-season, Fran basically asked me to come back in a full-time role if I was interested in it, or at least on a temporary basis, because I had a few offers from some teams down south to go down there. But I thought, you know what, I was burned out after the PhD, doing the PhD, and because essentially I was a PhD, full-time PhD student, full-time sports scientist at Celtic, and it was a lot. It was a lot on the plate on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, and I was really burned out. So I needed that 6 months to step back. And at that point, I wasn't sure if I was going to go back into full-time football at that point. But when Fran asked me, I'd come through that burnout phase, and I still had great relationships with some of the players at Celtic, some of the staff there. So I thought, you know what, I'll go back even on a temporary basis until we go through a full-time, or like a full and proper application process and all that, and then you appoint someone full-time. If it's me, great. If it's not, then at least I get to see if I really do want to come back in on a full-time basis and go back into full-time football. And I suppose it's a similar idea to Aki's. I was back in the door maybe 3-4 weeks, and I was like, I'm back. I want to be back in here, especially at that club. And I went through the full process again through the interview process, and then I got it again. So I stayed on at Celtic in a full-time capacity, and I'd been there for the last, well, before I came to Houston, I was there for about 1.5 years, and probably, in fact, almost certainly the best year and a half, or the most enjoyable year and a half that I ever had coaching at that club. So yeah, great relationships with the players and the coaching staff. Loved every minute of that. That was, again, like I said, it was pretty quickly by the time I was back in the door, I realised, yeah, I'm probably back in the door and past that burnout phase. The PhD wasn't for me, but the coaching part certainly was. And yeah, I was in there for a year and a half before coming over with Fran to Houston.
So obviously it was a hugely successful time on the field for Celtic with so many domestic trophies. But how did you manage that from your job role as head of performance and ensuring that players were in peak condition throughout? It's a long season, and particularly here in Scotland, you're probably going to have to worry about that over there now. But the forever changing conditions, different pitches, etc. So was that side of things something that you really started to relish, and you can plan for your full season when you were in that full-time role?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big challenge, but at the same time, like I said, it's one that I relish, because I suppose when you can go, it's cliche, I suppose, when you say if you love what you do for work, then you never feel like you work a day in your life. Well, it's hard. You always feel like you're working, because it's there's a lot of pressure on you at Celtic. If you're not doing your job well, then they'll find someone else who will. Basically, any elite environment, that's going to be the case. But I love what I was doing there, so it was a lot of work. And essentially there as the head of performance from the women's team, the first team, all the way down through the academy, as we started to develop the academy as well. Working close with Michael Tui, who had eventually taken over the academy side of things and tried to really build up the academy, as he's doing now. So it was a lot of work, but it was work that I enjoyed. And when you enjoy working with a group of players as much as I enjoyed working with them, it makes it so much easier. And the same with the staff. I love working with that staff as well. So yeah, it was a challenge, but it was a good challenge. It's, for me, strength and conditioning it's almost like a puzzle. You're trying to put together different pieces of the puzzle to make these players better physically, to make them better at playing the way that the manager wants to play. So for me, everything has to drive towards what the manager wants from an on-pitch standpoint. Everything is driven towards that. So then how do you program from a strength and conditioning side of things on the pitch and in the gym to make those players better at what they're doing on the pitch? How do we make them better at playing the style of football that the manager wants to play and that the club wants to play? And so it's like it's a problem solving activity essentially. And you can effectively choose the puzzle pieces as you want to fit to make that finished product, the finished product being the style of play on the pitch. So having the freedom and the autonomy to go about that how I wanted to go about that came from Fran. He basically just gave me the keys to that and said, look, I trust you, you go and do what you do. The players trusted me. And having that freedom and that autonomy to then put together a high performance programme to make sure that players are fit and ready and prepared to go and play the style of football that we want to play is, again, it's a challenge, but it's a fun challenge. If you love doing stuff like that, then it's great. That's one of the things you mentioned there, is in terms of like different surfaces and different pitches. To be honest, it wasn't too much of an issue for us, just because the majority of the teams, in fact almost all of the teams now in the league, play on Astro pitches, so 3G or 4G. The previous season, it was Rangers still played at the Rangers Training Centre, so they had grass pitches. But other than that, you more or less play on Astro every single week, so there's not too much of a difference from a preparation standpoint there. You're playing on Astro every single week. Weather conditions, I mean, it's always pretty bad weather in Scotland anyway, so you're more or less used to it. I would say probably the biggest challenge from a surface standpoint was when some of the players who had come from overseas and they'd be more used to playing on grass pitches, they would come in and they would struggle to acclimatise to the turf, like the AstroTurf here, for at least a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. Sometimes that manifested in like shin splints and stuff. But once you go over that initial period, and also because we played a very intense style of football at Celtic as well, training was intense. So just getting acclimatised to that and accumulating the loading that we need on those pitches, it could be a challenge, but as long as you're just managing it as much as you can, tying in with the physios. I was lucky to work with a couple of amazing physios at Celtic as well, which obviously helped my job, or helped me do my job. But yes, like I said, it was a challenge, there was lots to consider, but when you love approaching those challenges and love tackling those challenges because you're doing something you love doing, it makes it wholly worthwhile.
So this question is probably more rounded towards the league, but seeing it from your perspective, with Celtic, obviously the game's getting more and more professional. The standard, the training intensity of training across all clubs is increasing. So did you start to see the differences in the teams that maybe weren't challenging, or maybe a game that you would think would have been easier a couple of years prior? Did you start to notice that difference as well, and the standards getting raised?
For sure. I mean, and it's not just like you can see the standards getting raised between like the top three. So ourselves, well, Celtic, Rangers, City. Those standards were growing each year as well. That basically comes with the full professionalisation. You can see it in performances in the Champions League. The first year we were in the Champions League, we lost both those games when we were in back in September there. We were 30 seconds away from getting through that qualifying group. We came in as the fourth seed. We beat Brøndby, like I said, 30 seconds away from beating Vålerenga in Vålerenga Stadium, and then eventually we lost on penalties. So those three, the three top teams, the big three in Scotland, if you like, growing massively each season. But yeah, everyone else around that is, look, I would point to Partick Thistle as the main sort of example of that. How, as a part-time team, they finished in the top six last season. They've replicated that this season. I mean, they came into the SWPL one because Forfar effectively had to be removed from the league. So they came in when they finished, I think it was
I
third
think
in
it was third the year before, yeah, and then came up. Then
so they wouldn't
finished
necessarily, of course, they wouldn't necessarily be coming up,
yeah.
but they came up on that, and then they just kicked on. The job that Brian Graham has done is phenomenal. So that's probably the prime example. But then you look at like someone like Montrose this season who's come up, and I mean they just scored 7 goals in a game there at the weekend. They very easily could have taken points off Glasgow City a few months back, but they only lost 1-0. So there's games where, in the past, with all due respect to teams like that part-time teams, you maybe went into those games thinking that it's going to be a gimme. But now I really don't think it's anywhere close to being that. Of course, for the part-time teams and semi-professional teams, the deck is going to be massively stacked against them. It's only natural. Teams like Rangers and Celtic and City have the resources to bring some of the better players in Europe to the club. Whereas the semi-professional teams obviously can't do that yet. But I think it shows them in terms of what they can do at a semi-professional level if the clubs in a more holistic sense to get behind the women's teams and start putting in funding and start to drive the professionalisation there, then there really could be some decent parity in the league quite soon. And you've seen the rocket strapped to the women's game in Scotland. It's already improved exponentially in the last 3 or 4 years. So I think it will only continue to do that. And it's great to see. It's the best thing for the league for sure.
So now, as we touched on at the beginning, you've made the move to America. How was that one broached with you? As I said at the beginning, you weren't expecting it with Fran going over, as you've just discussed. He was involved in the interview process for you going to Celtic with the PhD programme. The first is you obviously got a fantastic relationship with him. We've had him on here. He's a really interesting guy. You can tell his team play the way that he is, really intense, really calculated. So it must be a fantastic guy to work under for yourself to then decide to go over with him.
For sure. I mean, I've probably never had a better relationship, and I'm lucky that since I've been in football, every manager that I've worked under has been excellent. I've had great relationships with all of them, but the best relationship that I've had with any manager I've ever worked with in any sport is Fran, and part of that is it took a minute to get some proper buy-in, as it will anyway. You go anyway, but once he's bought in, and again for the last year and a half, it's been extremely rewarding because as a strength and conditioning coach, you just effectively want to be able to go and implement your ideas and have the autonomy to do that without being leaned on by a manager in terms of, and not that it's always a bad thing, but if you have that autonomy and that freedom to go and do what you want to do from your end of things, because you're in theory the expert on that, where the manager maybe isn't necessarily always, that it shows a level of trust that in that environment, you want to be working in that environment. So, yeah, for the last year and a half at Celtic, I certainly had that. And when he asked me to come with him, again, if nothing else, that shows the level of trust that someone like that has in you. You know, if you work with a manager and he has a chance to come to, you know, to maybe the best league in the world and he wants to take you with him, then at the absolute worst, it's a massive confidence boost. So when he asked me to do that, I was like, you know what, I love what I do at Celtic. It wasn't like I wanted to leave Celtic. I loved it there, but if nothing else, a chance to go and challenge myself in probably the best league in the world, in the States, something that I've always wanted to do, and to go there with a manager that trusts me implicitly I don't want to say it was a no-brainer. It should have been a no-brainer, but because of the relationships I had at Celtic, it still made it a very difficult decision. But in the end, it was something that I had to do.
Now, I know you've only been there a couple of weeks, so I'm not going to ask you too much in too much detail because you're obviously still finding your feet there, but just your initial thoughts in being in and around the environment. I know probably something that Celtic couldn't offer you was, I know you were just in a training camp in Florida last week, so that's a bonus right away. But how's it been since you went in? Some of the differences that have hit you right away?
It's been hectic. There's a lot of the external stuff where, you know, I just moved over. I've been living in a couple of hotels, trying to sort out an apartment, trying to sort out a car, trying to sort out like bills and stuff like that. That's made the actual on pitch and all that kind of stuff a bit more hectic. But right now, I mean, the environment is great. It's, you know, the facility that we train at is excellent. It's both the Houston Dash and the Houston Dynamo, so the men's team and the women's team share the same facility, and the facilities are amazing. The gym, the indoor turf for warm ups and stuff like that. The pitches themselves, it's great. And you know, I'm still getting to know a lot of the players and the staff. But right now, I mean, as people, like it's a great environment to be in already. I'm not just saying that because I'm here. It really is. And yes. I think it's one of those things where I'm really excited to continue building and get to do even more. But it's still a finding my feet phase, but it's exciting. And yes, like I said, this league it's next level. So everything is about as good as it can be. We actually were over at the stadium that we play in yesterday for like, you know, pictures and media stuff, and just looking around the stadium, the changing room is phenomenal. It's so I'm excited to get going properly when the season starts. But yeah, it's a whole different world over here, to be honest.
So as one final parting shot, as I said at the beginning, you're the prime example of there's still avenues and pathways to go to work at an elite level if you've got the drive to do it. So how important would you say for players not just to rest on they're in an academy right now, I'm going to be a footballer, it doesn't work out for everybody, but they can fall back on education to then get them to the next best thing?
It's massively important, and you know, I think that's something that kind of flies under the radar. It was the same when I was 16. I thought I'm good enough to be a footballer, and I mean, you could ask any of the players at Accies and Celtic and any of the coaches, that was never going to be the case when I'm joining in there. I'm not actually allowed to join in now because I slide tackle too many people. So I was always a bit of a hatchet man, so I was never going to make it. But just because you don't necessarily make it as a footballer, there are so many avenues that you can go down. If you want to stay in football, then there are so many avenues, whether that be coaching. Coaching probably the best example of so many people moving in like that direction if playing it doesn't become a feasible career choice. Again, now there's university, you can go to university, there's so many degrees in terms of whether it's sports coaching, sport development, strength and conditioning, sports science, performance, whatever it might be. There are tons of different avenues that can bring you back into football just in a different role. It might not be the playing role, and it might take a while for someone to reconcile that, okay, you're not going to be a professional footballer, but you can still be involved in professional football and have an amazing career out of that. I'm a prime example of that. I suppose you're a primary example of that. So it's there's so many things you can do in football. So don't necessarily feel like football's done with you if playing as a footballer isn't where you progress to, because there's so many other things you can do in the sport.
That's brilliant, Andy. An absolute pleasure to hear from you, and I wish you all the best in the upcoming season.
Thank you, mate. I appreciate it.
Not at all. And thanks everyone for watching SWPL My Story.